Marco Rosero Rossi. I'm the executive director for an organization called Washingtonians for Public Banking. I'm glad to be here with one of our board members who acts as our treasurer, Martin Tallarico. And I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you about the history of our organization, what is public banking, what we think it can do for Washington State, recent legislation that's come up, and then what I think your organization can do to fight for public banking and join the movement that is across the United States and in some ways international to try to promote public banking. So first off, let's talk about the history of our organization, what we stand for. The idea of public banking has been what I refer to as the political ether in Washington State since the Great Recession, so this is about 2008. With the collapse of the banking sector and the Great Recession, public banking was proposed as an option that the state should pursue to deal with the financial crisis. Unfortunately, during that time, the idea didn't pick up much momentum. There were some groups who really kept the idea alive, particularly in the League of Women Voters, and there was a cadre of really dedicated activists who were committed to the idea. I'd say I'm fortunate to work with Martin, and he was one of those people who really kept the idea alive in Washington. But there wasn't necessarily an organization which coalesced these various forces and worked to build a broad coalition that you could force legislators to institute this idea. And that was the inspiration for Washingtonians for Public Banking. The organization is relatively new. It was incorporated in March of 2022, so it's just over a year old, all right? And its mission is to promote public banking throughout Washington State at all levels of government where it's appropriate. Now, if you aren't sure about public banking, I can go a little bit, explain a little bit what it is, talk about what it can do, and why, especially as Americans, we have a unique tradition of public banking. Even though the idea may seem very radical, it's actually really homegrown. So what is public banking? It is any bank that is owned by a public institution, so essentially a form of government. So that can include at the state level, include the county, municipal level, or the national government. Or it could even be some type of local governing institution, like a port commission here in Washington State. One of the things that I was excited to hear Teresa Mosqueda talk about is the struggle as a stepping stone, going from one struggle to the next and building off your wins. And one of the things that I think is really beneficial with public banking is that it's a big step that allows us to step in a lot of different areas, and we can accomplish a lot of things from it. Because what it means when you have a public institution, a democratic institution that controls the banking sector, that has its own bank, it means that the people of that area have control over the finances and lending practices. They have control over the capital and investments of that area. So they can choose to invest in social needs rather than through private profits. And so we have a lot of areas in Washington State that we know that are in dire need of investment. We need critical investments in infrastructure for our roads, bridges, and for public transit. We have a climate crisis that we're not preparing for, and we're not fortunate with the militancy to remove fossil fuels off our grid and bring in clean forms of energy. And we have a chronic housing shortage that no matter how hard we try, it doesn't seem like we can build enough housing to make it affordable for people. Well, a public bank could help us with all those crises, because what it would do is would allocate capital and investments to those areas to help us build our way out of it. Now, a public bank could be a bank that is chartered by a government that forms as an original institution, or it could be originally a private institution that a government buys the majority of shares of and makes it public de facto by having the controlling votes of it. In that, public banking, if you have those two types of forms, public banking is something that has existed in the United States since its founding. When the Revolutionary War happened, the United States found itself in tremendous debt. And how did we get out of it? Well, what we did is we established a public bank for the federal government. It was originally called the Hamiltonian model, where Alexander Hamilton proposed a public bank for the United States. And it wasn't something that was foreign to the colonies at the time, because a lot of the states, even before the Revolution, engaged in public banking. And one of the things they were frustrated about, they had these public land banks that offered mortgages to farmers to help them get up. And one of the things they're frustrated about is that the monarchy, the British monarchy at the time, Parliament would veto these projects by states to create their own public banks. So America, one of the things that is part of our democratic tradition is this banking model. The first bank was chartered only for a limited period of time. They did charter a second bank that was really important after the War of 1812, when the United States again found itself in tremendous debt. And then we also engaged in public banking to help us deal with the Civil War and then to pull us out of the Great Depression. So it's something that exists on the federal level in various forms. Unfortunately, it hasn't been something that's continued on, but we have chartered it at different times in American history. We also have numerous states engage in their own banks throughout American history. The most notable one is in North Dakota, where they've had a Bank of North Dakota owned by the state of North Dakota since 1919, so over a 100-year-old institution. And in that time, that bank has been profitable every single year it operates. And it's critical for offering infrastructure loans and helping out farmers throughout the state. It also offers low-interest loans for students, and it's an important part of the financial infrastructure to supporting community banks and credit unions. So the small banks rely on the Bank of North Dakota to get loans, get access to credit so they can survive. And because of that, there are more banks in North Dakota per population than any other state in the country, all right? And it has a very secure and very robust financial market where there's a lot of players, not a lot of monopolization, because they're all supported by that big bank. And in addition to all those examples, we can also look to the territory of American Samoa. They established their own public bank when the Bank of Hawaii pulled out, and they were left without any banking services. So the territory, the governing territory, said, well, what we're going to do is we're just going to establish our own bank. And they provide banking services for the people there. And then lastly, tribes throughout this country have engaged in their own banking. And there are 9 banks in the United States that are owned by tribal governments. A lot of those banks are the tribe owns the majority of equity, so they have controlling shares in it. Nonetheless, they all own and operate for the benefit of those tribes rather than the benefit of any one individual in their personal profit. Now let's talk a little bit about the legislation that has come up to help support public banking here in Washington State. As I mentioned before, public banking is something that's been in the political atmosphere. People have kind of has been an idea that has been rattling around for a while, and it has made it through the state legislature in a few times with limited progress. The most successful effort was in 2018, where there actually was a bill that made it through the Senate and made it to the House, and there was a study done, but unfortunately the bill ended up dying in committee, all right? It never came to the House floor for a vote. Most recently, there was a bill introduced by Senator Patty Cooter of the 48th District. She introduced it in the Senate. It had 13 co-sponsors, so about half of the Democratic caucus supported it. But unfortunately, that bill ended up dying in committee. It went to the Business Finance Committee, and that committee is split between 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans. And one Democrat, Mark Mullet, who is a very conservative Democrat who has a history of working in the banking industry, voted against releasing that bill out of committee. All right. And we know that he has, speaking with people in state legislature, we know that he has a pretty fierce opposition to the idea of public banking. All right. But the failure of that bill was something that I think ended up inspiring our organization, Washingtonians for Public Banking, to put our mission into high gear. So what we did in the aftermath of that is we created a county-by-county strategy of organizations that we're going to rely on in those areas to build a grassroots coalition for public banking. The model that's being proposed in the State House is a financial cooperative for local governments. So if a municipal, local government, tribal government owns this financial cooperative, and then they can get access to infrastructure loans through a public banking model. So we are working to push local governments to tell state legislatures that we want to see this model enacted. So in this county-by-county strategy, which includes Thurston, Pierce, King, Snohomish, and Spokane. And we chose those because we know that we have support in those areas for this type of idea. And these counties also represent strategic bottlenecks that we think that if we can get legislators on board in these counties, it's likely we can get a majority in the State House. But these counties, we want grassroots organizations like yourself to take a position on public banking, to pressure your school boards, your port commissions, your utility districts, your municipalities, your county governments to start passing resolutions that support public banking. Then we're going to take these resolutions and use them as leverage to go to state legislatures and say, listen, you've told us this, you think this idea has some interest, but you're not feeling the heat. You're not feeling the pressure from organizations. You don't think there's a real demand for it. Well, now we have an entire grassroots movement. We have a strong coalition, and we have local governments on board here to bring the heat. Here to say this is something we need in Washington State. There's no way we're going to be able to deal with climate change, fund our infrastructure, and get ourselves out of our housing shortage unless we make massive investments, and this is a way to make massive investments. So what's something that your organization can do? Well, one of the things that we have done is gone to organizations with a resolution, which I've already passed on to Alex, and we've asked you to pass this resolution in some form. We're okay if you make some modifications that so it adheres to whatever language you think is appropriate for your organization. But what we want essentially is a statement from your organization saying that you support public banking. And then once you make that statement, we have a list of coalition members, and we put you on that list of coalition members. And then we make sure to contact you when it's time to receive action in your area. The other thing is that in addition to your own organization coming out with public banking, we would appreciate it if you have connections to other organizations or statewide organizations, getting them to do the same thing so we can grow our coalition. And then, as I mentioned before, putting pressure on those local governments to have them have statements to support public banking, and making sure those statements have a commitment to lobby for it, commitment to action. So it's not just a statement, that's in the air, that's a feel-good statement, but something that says, no, when time comes, you're going to actually take some action for this. And then finally, is to mobilize people to support a public banking legislation on the state level. So what we will do is, once we know that the next legislation happens and we have another bill up, we're going to contact our coalition members and say, this is the bill, these are the people we need to contact, this is the message we need to say, so that our lawmakers know that public banking is a high priority for us, and we see it as a way of benefiting all citizens of Washington State, but especially those who have struggled with poverty, as a way of stabilizing our economy and making it so that we have a prosperous state that can lift up everyone. So I'm happy to take any questions about the movement we're trying to accomplish, any questions about public banking, and any questions about what you see as a role in your organization. Go ahead.
I'm curious, how does the bank raise revenue initially? Like, let's say it's the statewide bank. And do you think people would be less opposed to it fiscally than straight up taxing and investment as far as fiscal hawks?
Yes.
Go?
So the bank, I would say that the bank does have support in some rural communities and more conservative communities that have an ideological opposition to taxes. So North Dakota is a good example where it's a red state. A lot of those communities that really rely on the bank and are very supportive also tend to be communities that also vote Republican. All right. And they see the bank as a way of getting revenue to their communities, getting investments to the communities without housing to raise revenue. The model that they work is that the bank operates as the depositor for the state. So local governments, state governments, when they take in their revenue, what do they do with it? Well, they deposit it into a bank and then pull it out when you need it, just like we do. All right. Usually, almost always, it's a private bank. So what North Dakota does is we have our own bank that we deposit our state revenues in, and then we lend against those deposits to make our investments. And as long as the state is financially secure and isn't too reckless with its money, they can lend against it because those deposits are backed with the full faith and credit of the state of North Dakota. That's a model that we want to move toward in Washington State. I would say that these are part of our people organization who really want to try to move beyond that model, because the Bank of North Dakota is bank to bank. Like I said, it really secures a lot of the community banks and credit unions in the state, but doesn't engage in a lot of what's referred to as real-time banking. So nobody goes to the Bank of North Dakota and opens their own checking and savings account. They do it through a community bank or a credit union. All right. Unfortunately, the bill that is being posed by Cooter's office doesn't go that far. There is some concern about that. Some people raise the argument that they think that type of model will violate the Washington State Constitution. I would say that there are people in our organization who are skeptical of that. A lot of those legal opinions come from one source. We are right now trying to get legal analysis of that to see how strong those arguments are. Working on this project, I could say when we first got into it, a lot of people brought up that issue, but more research done, I think that argument's a lot weaker than people initially said. All right. The bank that is being proposed in Washington State, like I said, would be a bank based on kind of like a credit union for local governments. So they would join, they would have a capital, and then they would invest in infrastructure projects, and then they would pay off the loans, and it would recapitalize the bank. All right. The initial capitalization needs to come from someplace, and the model right now kind of says would come from a mixture of state and federal funds to help capitalize it, and then it would grow over time. All right. Our hope, and I think there's hope even among some legislators who are proposing this, is that model is a first step, and we can build off that over time to make something more robust in the long run. And I see the question over here.
And I apologize if I didn't hear everything, because unfortunately I don't. I was going to ask the difference between co-op, credit bank, public bank, private bank, and so the question you just asked about how do they begin money, did I hear that the answer is people put investment in and choose a director, and that's the beginning of a private bank?
I think this is an excellent question. It's something that a lot of people get confused on. It's a question we get often. So what's the difference between a private bank, a credit union, and a public bank? And there's even another form of bank called a mutual bank. So there's two types of distinctions that you need to make. One is a distinction between public and private. So a public bank is a bank that's owned by a public institution, which is a form of government. That is a public bank. So anytime you have a bank that's owned by a public institution, that becomes a public bank. A credit union, a mutual bank, or a privately owned bank that's there to owned by an individual or a corporation that's incorporated, those are all private institutions. So they are private banks. All right. Now, in that distinction between public and private, there's also a distinction between nonprofit and profit making. So a private bank that is owned by an individual or a corporation, they are for-profit institutions. They're there to maximize profit of their shareholders. A credit union is a nonprofit institution. They're just supposed to represent their members, but the members are private citizens. All right, they're still a nonprofit institution. A public bank is a bank that operates on a nonprofit basis and is a public institution, is owned by a public institution. That's what makes it
Meaning a government.
A government, yeah. That's what makes a public bank a public bank. And I should say that the nonprofit, because it can be possible that you could have a bank that's chartered privately, but the government owns the majority of shares, so it becomes de facto public. In that situation, the returns that the government gets are still used on a nonprofit basis because the government just reinvests them into public goods. But other people who own different shares make profit off the bank. All right, that's a possibility. So it can get very complex, and there are some nuances. But that's the thing that you need to know is that a public bank is a bank that is publicly owned and it's run on a nonprofit basis. That no individual gets to take the surplus. Then it just goes back to a public institution and is used for the social good. Any other questions?
Is there any history of public banks becoming bankrupt?
Yes. I'd say sort of. A lot of the states that have public banks, at this point, they had them about 200 years ago. So trying to dig up the history of them is very difficult. Vermont is a state that had a state bank. And they didn't necessarily go bankrupt, but there was one branch that had an issue with corruption. The other branches didn't, but one that had an issue with corruption. And it ended up spilling over to a big scandal statewide, and the legislators decided to end the charter on it. It was a bank that also was dealing at the time, like I mentioned, the War of 1812. There was a huge economic crisis, and the bank was really struggling during that time to weather the storm like Congress, but every bank was struggling during that time. If the legislatures didn't decide to cancel it because of one of the branches got corrupt, would it have survived? Maybe, possibly, it could have, but it's hard to say, But the legislatures, the it's a really interesting history because they had one branch that was really corrupt. People engaged in the corruption, of course, ended up finding this clever way to get off, and then they ended up killing the whole banking process. So it really was some nefarious forces got a hold of it, took everything they could, and then destroyed the institution. So a lot of stuff that happens today, unfortunately.
I guess her question about bankruptcy is making me ask again about the public regulation and where those rules come from in terms of a government beginning a bank, public bank.
So it's a bit
How the
different.
regulations
Yeah.
apply.
So it's a bit different. So public banks are not insured by the FDIC, the Federal Reserve. The FDIC only insures private banks, and then there's a whole other government agency that looks after credit unions. So they don't have FDIC insurance. So like I said, the Bank of North Dakota, there's no insurance of those deposits. It's only secured by the full faith and credit of the Bank of North Dakota. Same thing with the Bank of American Samoa. Tribal governments are a bit different because of the unique legal parameters that tribal governments have in our country. It's a very complicated situation because tribe governments, even though they're governments and they represent their tribe as a people, they are still considered private institutions. So they have, it's a very complicated area of the law about their jurisdiction over their own banks. But the Bank of American Samoa and the Bank of North Dakota, they're not overseen by the FDIC and don't get FDIC insurance in that way. Well, I mentioned that our movement is national, and one of the states that have taken up this cause is the state of California. And they passed legislation in California to authorize a lot of their counties and municipalities to start forming public banks, and they're trying to work on that. And part of the legislation said that they would seek FDIC insurance and be part of, to fall within the regulatory regime of the FDIC. So they are, working aggressively to get that done in the deadlines that they had set for their legislation. The examples that we have, the Bank of North Dakota predates the FDIC. Predates the Federal Reserve. It's not surprising they had a model that existed before we had a modern regulation. But it is a very complex and nebulous area of where some of the regulation relies when we're talking about our federal banking system.
Because I might not want to invest without insurance. Looking at the crypto mess we're in with government
That's
in jail for all the crypto problems and whatever because regulations weren't established to help them. Mm-hmm. Or that's why I would want some support, insurance or regulation.
I think that's understandable. If you had retail banking, remember the Bank of North Dakota doesn't have any retail banking, so you're never going to put your deposit in the Bank of North Dakota. But remember, your insurance is your government, so it's insured by the full faith and credit of your government. So if we had the state of Washington have its own bank similar to North Dakota, as long as the state of Washington, as long as you're willing to elect a responsible treasurer, someone who wasn't, overly corrupt or completely incompetent, you could have some certainty that the banking system, that the public banking system would be secure. Because as long as your state is secure and they're not engaging in overly, ridiculous practices, then you should be okay. And remember, our state does have some requirements for debt limits and does have some constraints it puts on itself and how reckless its own practices can be. And you as a voter, as a resident of the state, you can fight for that. You have say over the institution. If you don't like who's being appointed to the institution, you can work to change that. And so it has, in some ways you could argue, it's the most secure because it has the greatest oversight, which is the people themselves.
Yeah. What is the intention? What does your organization do?
So what we do is we try to educate people throughout Washington State, organizations like yourself, about public banking, raise awareness with ideas, and then, like I said, promote public banking at every level of government throughout Washington State. So we are fighting to campaign to get it on the state level, but we also want to see it on the city and county level, because we really think that this offers a new model for our financial system, a model that will take our financial system away from a few monopolistic institutions that, due to the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession, due to the crypto crisis, due to the modern regional banking crisis that we have really shown that to be irresponsible with people's money, have really shown that in the pursuit of profit, they often run roughshod over people's needs, that they don't make investments that we need them as a society, and they are often reckless even when their own very institutions. And so our hope is that we can have this model take root in Washington, be the next state that introduces a public bank, and then have it spread throughout the country as an alternative way, as a new way of controlling our finances. One that is more democratic, that puts it in the hands of the people.
Good.
Well, once a public bank is established, can it be immune to political influence?
I think it depends on the governing structure of the bank. Of course, nothing is 100% immune from political influence. And I did mention, Vermont had an example where one of their branches was, ended up being corrupt down to the core. And so it's a possibility. I could say, I lived in Washington for years, and I moved to Chicago, and I got my PhD in Chicago, and I ended up studying a lot of corruption, being in it for Illinois. So I'm very aware that it's easy that you can have public institutions be captured by a few nefarious forces who really want to bend them for their own personal will. So I think it's a concern, but it all depends on the governing institutions that we have over public banks. Or what type of governing board, what type of oversight are we going to have? Are we going to have an inspector general? If we have a lot of public banks, we could have an inspector general role the public banking system. All these things we could do. But the benefit of all of them is that you, as voters, you can decide. Something you could advocate for, it's something you could press your local legislators for, saying this is how we want this institution run. In a private banking system, you can't do that. Unless you buy a bunch of shares in the bank, you have no real say over the governing process of it. And none of us, very few of us are millionaires who just have, tens of millions of dollars lying around, or hundreds of millions of dollars in a lot of cases, to just buy a bunch of shares in a Bank of America, or those banks you were talking in the billions, and dictate them the governing structure of that organization. Well, in a public bank, as long as our system of government operates on one person, one vote, your decision power is just as valuable as the next person's.
I love your trust in the one vote.
It's a tepid trust. I understand. It's inspirational trust. I'll say that, because I understand there's a lot of nuances to that, and we have far from a perfect democracy. But I will say that a public banking system is far more democratic than the system of finance that we have today.
If I might just speak up about the Bank of North Dakota, Marco said, it's been in existence for over 100 years, and in North Dakota they work hand in hand with their private banks, and also in the state of North Dakota they've never had a bank that's failed because they work hand in hand with each other. It's very well run. Washington Public Bank would have a board of elected officials, both elected and official and appointed by the state government. So there'd be transparency, there'd be accountability, and like Alex said, there'd be, some of them would be voted members as well. So
the current legislation that's being considered has a 9-person board. 5 of them would be elected from the local governments that are members of the organization. So if King County or Seattle joined the bank, then your representatives in Seattle would elect someone to represent them at the bank, and so you could have some say that you have say over your council members. And then the 3 of them would be appointed by the governor with the consent of the Senate, so you would have some say over that, over your senator and who you vote for governor. and the last one would be appointed by the government from the treasurer's office.
Yeah, I'm just checking to see if there are any more questions.
Any other questions?
Sweet.
You didn't
Okay.
thought about
Well-
the federal level?
What? I'm sorry.
You didn't thought about the federal level?